This is Views from Washington Park, courtesy of real estate team Everything Home, Colorado. The city of Denver recognizes two neighborhoods with the name Washington Park. Those neighborhoods are Washington Park and Washington Park West. For this episode of Views, we will be focusing on Washington Park. Washington Park is an old, beautiful, and affluent neighborhood that sits north of the University neighborhood in South Denver. Originally known as Myrtle Hill in the early 1890s, the neighborhood eventually took its name from the actual Washington Park that was laid out in 1889 by famed landscape architect Reinhard Schutz and is still the main attraction in the neighborhood to this day. The boundaries of the Washington Park neighborhood are Spear Boulevard to the north, I-25 to the south, University Boulevard to the east, and Downing Street to the west. Born in and trained in Germany, Reinhard Schutz came to America in 1889 with a comprehensive knowledge of garden design and engineering. Around the time he was hired to design and implement a plan for Denver's new Fairmount Cemetery. He ended up doing such a great job that in 1893, he was hired as Denver's very first landscape architect. In this position, he was responsible for the design and development of Denver's park and parkway system alongside his peers Charles Mulford Robinson and George Kessler. During his tenure, Mr. Schutz was responsible for designing Congress Park, Cheeseman Park, the grounds that the state capitol sits on, Fairmount Cemetery, Washington Park, and more. Washington Park was developed in the 1890s and early 1900s. It is a scenic and recreational park that sits on about 160 acres of land. The park features two lakes, a huge meadow, and historic structures such as a 1911 bathhouse, a boathouse built in 1913, and Eugene Field Cottage, which was moved to the park in 1930. The actual Washington Park was formed around an early irrigation project that the city hired John Smith to complete. Mr. Smith completed the 24-mile irrigation ditch in 1867, and it was called Big Ditch or Smith's Ditch. The irrigation ditch went from South Pratte River to the area we now know as Capitol Hill. Smith's Ditch was the first major irrigation canal in Denver, and the hundreds of smaller canals that branched off of it enabled settlement and farming further away from Denver's rivers. On top of creating the ditch, Mr. Smith also created a lake where the ditch passed a natural depression on his land. The lake became known as Smith's Lake, and Mr. Smith used it as a reservoir and as a source of ice in the winter. In 1875, the city of Denver purchased Smith's Ditch for $60,000, and it became known as City Ditch. The city later purchased Smith Lake in the early 1900s. People who lived close by Smith Lake always saw the lake as a natural spot for a park. When the town of South Denver was formed in 1886, it failed to create a park. However, when South Denver was annexed to the city of Denver in the 1890s, the city committed itself to the development of a park around Smith Lake. The park started to become a reality at the end of the 1890s, and in 1899 it was named Washington Park in honor of former President George Washington's death. At the time, city landscape artist Reinhard Schutz drew up the plan for the park, and John B. Lang was hired as its first superintendent. Smith Lake was already in place. Great Meadow, the largest meadow in Denver Park system, was built from 1901 until 1907. Grassmere Lake on the southern end of the park was created in 1906. When Reinhard Schutz passed in 1910, his successor, Sacco de Boer, took over planning at the park. Washington Park's two main historic structures are the bathhouse just north of Smith Lake and the boathouse on the lake's southern side. The bathhouse was built in 1911, the same year Smith Lake opened for swimming. On opening day, 200 swimmers appeared. Use of Smith Lake for swimming was free, but everyone was not free to use it. During this time, Smith Lake's swimming area was for whites only. In 1932, 150 Black Americans showed up to Smith Lake with the intention of swimming and integrating the park. Park manager Walter Lowry and police chief Albert Clark urged the protesters to leave before trouble broke out. The protesters instead demanded police protection. The Black Americans entered the water, but shortly after, the white swimmers who had left the lake returned with clubs and stones, and fighting broke out for over an hour and a half and spread to 10 blocks on the east side of the park as a crowd watched. Police arrested 17 people, 10 Black and 7 white, who had encouraged the protesters to assert their rights. Afterwards, there was no further violence or demonstration. The Free Smith Lake Swimming Beach was part of Denver life until 1957 when it closed. Pollution, the polio scare, and difficulty chlorinating the lake were the reasons for the closure. In 1971, construction of the Recreation Center gave Wash Park an indoor pool. The lake is still popular for fishing and boating to this day. An extremely important piece of the Washington Park neighborhood is South High School. Although South High School is the youngest of the directional high schools, Denver South has a tradition that stretches back to Denver's earliest days. In those early days, the south side of Denver was the least populous and didn't get its own school until 1883. The school was called the Grant School and served all elementary through high school students. In 1907, a separate junior and senior high school were added to Grant School. It was unofficially known as Denver's Southside High School. The South High School we know today is built on 172 acres of land that once belonged to the Colorado and Southern Railroad. One DPS goal was to locate new high schools, south, east, and west, near parks and boulevards, and the location for South High School was considered one of the most beautiful in the city. South High cornerstone was laid on October 31st, 1923. The first classes were held in January 1926. South High School was designed by prominent Denver architecture firm Fisher & Fisher. The building is inspired by the Basilica of Santa Maria Cosmedin in Rome, a church famous for housing the skull of Saint Valentine. In 1935, Alan True painted murals in the main entrance hall of South High School. The southwest wing was built in 1964, and a new gym was built in 1989. In Washington Park, you will find many large modern mansion-style homes, but you also find many of the original Tudor-style and bungalow homes that were built from the late 1890s through the 1940s, as well as lots of duplexes, Denver squares, and contemporary and Victorian architecture. Many of the older homes have been renovated, but new construction is everywhere, as a lot of buyers have simply chosen to scrape older homes and build new. The Washington Park community is a very active and serene place to be. You will always find people running, jogging, riding bikes, walking dogs, and generally just enjoying the neighborhood. You can spend hours marveling at the amazing architecture, and it's also close to other incredible neighborhoods such as University and Cherry Creek. Washington Park is also complemented by close access to major traffic routes, which makes it easy to maneuver around the city. It's an amazing place to be and also has a handful of great churches, which add to the incredible atmosphere. This concludes Views from Washington Park. If you or anyone you know is interested in buying or selling a home in the old neighborhood, I hope you won't hesitate to reach out. And don't forget, not only will we guide and manage your real estate transaction from start to finish, but we take care of nearly all of our clients' relocation expenses professionally, free of charge. I want to thank you for joining me again here today, and we look forward to working with you.